Hello everybody and welcome to yet another episode of CLOL Office Hours, where this week we're also live on the Salty Runback YouTube channel as well as the Patreon, of course. Now, clearly, if you guys have been following the channel, you noticed that we did take a bit of some time off. Just the times to record episodes didn't end up working out, and just we were feeling very busy, very stressed out with all the stuff that's been happening this season and also with kind of our lives. So in preparation for episode 100 of Salty Runback, we decided to take a week off, do a little bit of a reset, get back into things here. But that doesn't mean that CLOL Office Hours stops here. And so that is what we're going to be posting here today on the YouTube channel. And if you do like this, well, obviously CLOL is getting closer to its conclusion, but you can watch the full backlog of videos by subscribing to the Salty Runback Patreon page, which you can get for a $5 a month subscription by clicking the link below. And this is going to be a pretty standard office hours episode where we're not going to go into any specific, unique stuff here or there. We'll talk about a couple of the big news stories that have kind of broken around CLOL so far. And then, of course, the big thing that we're going to be doing is recapping the games that happened in week number 2 of the CLOL Championships, and then going into the previews of the games that are happening this weekend, starting today, as you are seeing this episode, with the top 16 being reduced to the top 8 just recently. So make sure you subscribe, make sure you like the video. This is just a solo episode with me, Grapes. If you are not familiar with what the format here of Office Hours is, I'm sure you've seen some of the other excerpts and stuff that we posted here on our YouTube channel. But with that being said, let's get into the episode. And what we're going to be starting off with is a recap, kind of not day by day specifically, but round by round, of how the different matchups did end up going in the CLOL Championship this past week. And we're going to talk about each of them a little bit, and then, of course, go on with the rest of the news. So let's start things off with our recaps, starting off in the upper quarterfinals. Now, these were the games that happened on Saturday for the most part, and all of them were situations where it was the top 8 in the upper bracket, the second round of the upper bracket, and if you won this game, you're guaranteed yourself a spot at least in the top 12, or at least in the top 12, I believe. Yes. And if you win this game, you guarantee yourself a spot in top 6, which is what all the teams that are currently the champions of have already locked themselves into. And that was kind of the stakes of this. This is just like the winners quarterfinals. Funnily enough, this would have been kind of what the actual quarterfinals of, the first round of the LAN would have been back in 2022, when the top 8 teams from CLOL were invited to the Riot Games arena. Obviously, things definitely look a little bit different these days. There's double elimination now, and now only 2 teams are going to LAN. But in the past, what used to end up happening was that the top 8 teams would go to LAN off of a single elimination format. And in that world, it would have been these 8 teams, technically speaking. But with that being said, let's get into how the actual games did go. Starting off with Maryville taking on Northwood, the number 1 seed versus the number 9 seed. A matchup that used to happen in the Northern Conference, of course, until Northwood joined the NECC. But looks like things still kind of remaining the same, with Maryville winning this one 3-0. Now, it is important to note that this series, basically, and this whole weekend, actually, in terms of just really proper context, was happening basically the same weekend, or kind of simultaneously with, or right after, immediately following the NACE LAN that was happening in Orlando, Florida. And specifically, Maryville actually were in Orlando at the time of this series being played. I believe they went to a local university to play at their esports lab. And with that being said, they did not play with the full original Dark Zero Dragonsteel roster that you might have become assimilated with and familiar with going into the start of the 2025 season. They ran with their subs in the mid-jungle, Shimmer and Toasty. Now, obviously, news breaking about Yuji joining Team Liquid as a 6-man kind of has created a situation where Maryville are not able to play with Yuji for the rest of CLOL, and so Shimmer likely will be subbing in for them for the remainder of the tournament. And I think the jury is still out on what the mid lane situation is going to look like. I know that basically all 5 of the starting Dark Zero Dragonsteel members were getting LTA looks, but I think Yuji so far is the only one that has been confirmed. And for specifically a player like Spyrax over Toasty, part of me is curious as to what Toasty could look like here, playing with this Maryville team. The other part of me just maybe wants to stick with the more experienced player. But this is an interesting debate that now has maybe opened up, as in the 2 rounds that Maryville have played, Toasty has played in both of them, and that includes round number 1 before any of the roster rumors did kind of pop up. I imagine, unless I haven't been told otherwise, but I think both mid laners should be eligible for this next round of games. So I'm curious to see what the decision ends up looking like for their next round. Obviously, they're playing up against Fisher, as you can see the spoiler alert on the other side. And in the NACL this past week, on Dark Zero Dragonsteel, Shimmer played the jungle, but it was Spyrax instead of Toasty in the mid lane. And I think this series actually was another reason as to why I kind of think that maybe Spyrax is just the right move to be playing on this team. I know a lot of us have been very hyped on Toasty. A lot of us have been very excited about what he could provide as a mid laner and even as a player that could be, in the LCS, in the LTA one day. He didn't have himself the best time against Northwood, and that was going up against Reppy, who obviously, is a pretty solid player in his own right, but I think when people put out tier lists, people would probably put Toasty ahead of Reppy in most situations. And the interesting thing about this series versus Northwood, which was streamed on my personal Twitch channel, by the way, /GrapesCast, if you want to check out the full VODs, was that actually this was a very close 3-0. And I think that for the most part, you can attribute parts of it to Maryville, doing the Maryville thing and trolling a little bit, but good on Northwood for being able to kind of respond to that and play a good game and play a good series, play competitive games against Maryville University. Again, we talk about these competitive games that people play against Maryville as being like high praise, and maybe that's like not maybe that should get called out or something, but I think honestly that I think Northwood looked like they were able to match up with Maryville, and if things didn't go specifically their Maryville's way towards the end of the games, there was definitely worlds that existed where Northwood could have picked up a win. I had them getting a win off of Maryville in my bracket, for example, when I did do the predictions at the start of the tournament. So Maryville ended up winning this one 3-0. However, all three of the games were above 30 minutes, including game number 2, which went to almost 50. And this was a very back and forth, very close game, actually. Will, on the Nefiri, ended the game 9-1-6 in a losing effort. He was doing a lot of stuff throughout all portions of the game. But the big winners for Maryville in this series were definitely Zamudo and Sajed. Zamudo in the top lane had himself really good games, specifically in games 1 and 2 on the Jace and the Gangplank, as you can see right here. 12-3 and 5 on the Gangplank at the end. This guy basically was like 6,000 gold ahead of Northwood's top laner Cozy by the 30-minute mark or so, which was like one of the most insane gold leads I'd ever seen watching a game of League of Legends. And the reason that Maryville were able to win this, I think, win that game number 2, come back from a situation where I think Northwood had a couple of Barons, had a Soul, was because of Zamudo specifically on this GP. He was full build by like 30 minutes, and then he got his 6th item by selling it, by not even buying boots, actually. Just picking up a 6th item Yomu's. Anything else to say about this series? Well, Shimmer, obviously, had a bit of a unique style coming into Maryville, and I like that he's kind of continuing to show that here on the Udyr in game number 1, and then he played his signature Shen jungle in game number 3, I should say, which was the clinching game. And that game 3 was a very interesting one because it felt like another situation where maybe Northwood were finding opportunities here or there, but this was kind of a situation where specifically Sajed was able to really put the team on his back. He dominated the laning phase. They killed Clyde a bunch of times in lane alongside Zyko. He got super fed on this Kai'Sa. End of the game 14-1-6. And Zamudo actually kind of got smacked around in this early game, this mid game. Probably the worst out of any of the games that we had here. And that is still a problem with Zamudo's game. I feel like if you can, he does play greedily, and so sometimes if you can abuse that, he can fall behind a little bit early. But he's always going to be getting his farm. He'll always get his gold. And as we see here, despite the fact I think he was 0-4 1 or something at some point in this game, he was able to get back to 4 items and eventually kind of just be a dominant Gwen anyway, despite the fact that he was going this Malignance build which doesn't have as much early game power, but maybe scales a little bit better later on with just the amount of pure damage that you have. You're a bit more of a glass cannon. Cozy's Kali had a good time against him. And yeah, that was resulted in Maryville kind of winning the series in Orlando with a new mid jungle. Am I super sold on how Shimmer and Toasty joining this team could impact the way Maryville win the national championship or their likelihood of doing so? I'm not 100% sure. I think Yuji leaving the team and being replaced by Shimmer is definitely a downgrade. I think everybody can agree with that. However, I still have Maryville as the favorites to win CLOL, And maybe this is a hot take, but I think I still have them as favorites to win the NACL. Just because of some of the individual performances that we've seen from Zamudo and Sajed specifically. I think those guys really have been playing some great League of Legends as of late. Of course, they always have been good players, even from like a couple of years ago, or even like last year, but I think right now both of them are really on peak form, and I think that those side laners specifically, if you can use your mid jungle, whether it's Shimmer and Spyrax or Shimmer and Toasty, to like get those guys ahead, that is what's going to help Maryville win. So a lot to talk about for that first series, but I think just tying that into the news about Shimmer joining the team and what the mid lane situation could look like is why I decided to spend a little bit more time on this series particularly. But Maryville move on to top 6, obviously, and are looking to continue their run to the upper finals, which a lot of people predicted them to do. As for Northwood, we'll talk about them more a little bit later. In the next round, we had Ole Miss playing up against Illinois State. I have a bit of a typo here. Ole Miss was the number 2 seed going up against the 7 seed ISU. And Ole Miss won this one 3-1. I think this could have been an expected result, but I think the big takeaway here was really how dominant Ole Miss looked a lot of this series. Game number 3 was a little bit of a different story. It resulted because basically the reason that Maryville lost that third game against ISU was basically came down to the fact that they ran it down in the first 5 minutes and got Fadi-chan 6 kills on Misfortune, and he was able to turn that into a big lead because he obviously is a very good player. But overall, throughout this series for Ole Miss versus ISU, the big takeaway to me was that Meslo, specifically in the mid lane, really struggled, and that'll carry into a little bit more of what we want to talk about with ISU later on. PCL had himself a bit of an up and down, back and forth series, but overall, I really liked what Stray had to offer, and while both AD carries did play very well, Shogun Rhino were better at the end of the day. I think a lot of that helped, give credit to Rhino in that situation as well. As you can see in all these KDAs and stuff like that, Barlow didn't necessarily have the best series for himself, but I think this matchup in the bot lane was like one that we highlighted. However, it is fun to see Ole Miss like really show out against an ISU roster that I think some of us had some high expectations for. I predicted them to go all the way to the finals, which obviously, as we'll see later, did not end up happening here. Keel played really well this series, I would say, as well. It might not show it in the KDA, but I thought the way he was moving around the map, helping out his team, was good. And it's just so funny to see Ole Miss look so good when they're playing in CLOL, and then in the NACL, somehow like things fall apart. I don't really know what's going on with that. We'll probably talk about it on Salty Runback with Hawk. I want to hear what his takes are on it. But some of those mistakes of like Ole Miss overextending for objectives, playing too many sides of the map, I feel like we see that less here in CLOL, and that could be because of worse competition, obviously. But I think that ISU was a competent enough opponent to be able to abuse some of those issues, and Ole Miss was able to kind of put a stop to that. Shout out to Shogo, also, who got a pentakill on the Smolder in game number 2. UST versus Western. This was the series of the day on Saturday, and it was Western taking it 3-2 in what was one of the crazier upsets that we have seen in all of CLOL so far, and that's saying something because we've seen the Eutectics rise so far. We'll talk about them, of course, a little bit later on in the show as well, but University of Western Ontario beating Winthrop, and then beating UST, and now making it into the upper semifinals is an incredible story for this team. We'll talk a little bit more about what their situation does look like a little bit later on in the episode, but for now, let's talk about how the series went, because man, oh man, were UST disrespectful as hell in this series. They seemingly didn't really come into this with much prep in terms of the drafts for what they were hoping like Western were going to play. I mean, most notably, the thing that bothered me was that the first 2 games, they left up the A-Soul for Julian, and I feel like if you don't have a specific answer to it, and maybe they thought they did, but it didn't really end up coming into fruition. If you're a team playing against Western, you have to be cognizant of that pick, and it seemed like it kind of caught them by surprise a little bit at the end of that one. So yeah, a little bit disappointed in that specifically here. But this was a crazy situation where Western actually jumped out to a 2-0 lead, I believe, because of the champions that they had. I'm gonna double check real quick because I'm pretty sure that is what happened, but I want to make sure I'm completely right. I want to talk about this game. I mean, this game too is crazy. Look at this. Julian 14, 3, and 10 on the A-Soul. Like, that is kind of the exact situation that you are trying to avoid when you were playing against this Western team. And I take it back, actually. UST did end up winning this first game. It was a lot closer than expected, though, and it's because of the fact that, the ASOL was in the game. And even though the rest of the map kind of got blown open, Chulian's ASOL able to kind of bridge the team into a really strong state of things. And in game number 2, that obviously showed as well. Game number 3 was, I think, also, I don't know, that was a weird, game 3 was a weird one overall, where, I don't know, this was won by UST, but it was like, it felt close for a little bit, and then I think at the end they just kind of won a couple of fights in a row, but like, or they aced them around Baron. They just flipped to Baron and then they won, which was like, even though the scoreboards look really good for USC, this felt a lot closer than what the game actually was. Game number 4, I think, was the craziest one though. This was a very weird, this was an insane situation. USC up 2-0, right? So they have the chance to potentially close out the series. And they just, I think they had a situation where they ran into the base of Western and were unable to end. And I think that happened in this game specifically. Oh, wait, no, that was game number 2. That was game 2 on the ASOL. So, sorry, I'm mixing some of my games up here because there was a lot of... Hold on. I want to make sure I'm getting all this right. So basically, yeah, okay. Game number 4, I should say. Western won. Shout out to Chulian on his jinx. He actually ended with 20 kills in this game. Chulian actually kind of be having a very specific champion pool and being very good at specifically late game team fighting is a very fun part of this team. And then in game number 5, the Nyla came out here for Chulian as well, a very unique pick, and he was able to do quite well on it as well. And this was a kind of a slow burn where it seemed like UST kind of just slowly threw away a big lead that they had and ended up losing the game, which was a very interesting situation. So I really didn't like the looks that I saw out of St. Thomas in this one. Specifically, just, I don't know. I didn't get to watch too much of the series altogether. I was kind of catching up on it as I was going back and forth with the Maryville stream. But overall, very surprising result. I think when you have Bradley and Array kind of on your team, you are expected to do pretty well against a team like Western, but shout out to Western for moving on, and we'll talk about them a little bit more later. The last series here is a reverse sweep that happened between St. Clair and Fisher. St. Clair were down 2-0 against Fisher and ended up losing the series 3-2. Very tragic situation for them, obviously. As you can see here, they did play with Lig this time around, even though he technically was comp banned for this week of games. They dominated on the Lucian Milio lanes in the first 2 games of the series. And then Fisher decided to adjust a little bit here. Obviously, it seemed like what was going for them did not end up working. And so they went to Brunus' Neferi, who he played for the next 3 games. And for some reason, St. Clair decided not to ban it. And I feel like in this meta, in this current state of things in CLOL, if you're playing against a Neferi player and you just got to ban it, because that champion is so OP, so game-breaking. Specifically against Maddie, who it became very clear Maddie was not a Neferi player. And that's fine. Obviously, we're in CLOL, champion pools can be whatever they are. But not being able to play that Neferi really helped Fisher here in this one. Brunus really carrying them to being able to save the series for them and move on to the upper semifinals. It was a very fun series to watch. That Game 5 ended up actually being very close. It was very low on kills. It seemed very safe until all of a sudden Fisher broke the game open with a fight. Ended up taking home the win there. But yeah, Lig played really well throughout the series. Sama had some rough ones. They ended up subbing a Ricky for Game 5, and it didn't end up really making much of a difference. But overall, I think St. Clair could have been happy with their performance, but the reason being that since they got reverse swept and because of the way the bracket was set up, they had to run into Winthrop in the lower bracket, as we're going to talk about a little bit later. So those are the upper quarterfinals. Let's move on to the other games that happened in lower round 3. The one game we're not going to talk about is Winthrop versus Minnesota. This was a 3-1 win for Winthrop, but we talked about it in our last episode of CLOL Office Hours because it happened the week prior, or happened a little bit earlier on in the week. So we're going to start things off with Grandview taking on Weber State University. And this was a very interesting series, all things considered, because of the fact that Grandview seemingly was also at the Nate's LAN, and this game started at, I think, 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern, and it was a best of 5, which meant we got pretty late into the night with this one. And you have to wonder if that affected Grandview a little bit, because even though they won game number 1 off of an insane Nightstar Tristana performance, we never got the same look from them the rest of the way in this lower bracket. And Weber State ended up really dominating the rest of the series. Gloomgrove playing 3 games of Varus is a very interesting development here to watch, or was a very interesting development to watch. Sticking Nightstar on Ziggs just was never my answer to things ever, and I don't know why they decided to do that, but unfortunately, just kind of is what it is there. But the big winners here was U13, who absolutely put the team on his back for these games. 13-1-20 on the Pantheon in Game 2, 12-7-21 on the Neferia in Game number 3, and 16-10 on the Viego in the clinching game. And none of these were particularly close except for Game 3, sorry. Game 3 was a banger. It went, I think, like 40 to 50 minutes. There was a lot of split pushing, with the Jace Ziggs in the 1-3-1. Mel for Jin Call actually worked pretty well. And that's like the first time we've seen a Mel in quite a little bit. Jex's Urgot went absolutely insane in this game as well, ending with 19 kills. And then game number 3 was a little bit more of a slaughter, where it was a slow burn, but eventually kind of just Weber took off. And U13 on the Viego was amazing. So shout out to Weber State for advancing to that top 12 stage. It was very impressive from them, and officially being the farthest that a West team has gotten since 2022. So a very cool story for them. They break that top 16 curse a little bit. And unfortunate for Grandview, because I know that they were a team that Hawk specifically was excited about. I was excited about as well. Their resume definitely said that they could have gone on a bit of a bigger run, but they just didn't put it together at the right moments, unfortunately. And so they ended up being eliminated in the top 16 stage. Who was not defeated in the top 16 stage were their counterparts in Purdue Northwest, who went 3-1 over SCAD in a win. A bit more of a back and forth series than the 3-1 might suggest. This was on the main Uni Esports stream that Simo and Hawk were casting. And game number 1 was a dominant victory for Purdue Northwest, we went a little bit back and forth, but overall very clean. And the reason that it was is because of a bit of an adjustment that Purdue Northwest made going into week 2, which was particularly interesting to me. So they, for the entirety of the season, Purdue Northwest were running with Udon Bidon as their AD carry and Nukes as their support. And Nukes is a very good support player. He played support on Dorado Gaming that made a big run of the OQs. Udon Bidon, though, support player for Purdue Northwest as recently as 2022. So this guy, in my mind, always kind of envisioned him as being a support player, and that is why when this roster got announced, I was a little bit concerned for them, because even though they had players like Prank and Nukes and Aujin that I thought were going to be good, seeing a player like Udon Bidon in the support position was a little bit worrisome for me. But Purdue Northwest, after their series loss to St. Clair, where they got obliterated by Miracle AD Carry, decided to make a bit of a change, and they swapped actually Nukes into the AD Carry position. Now, Nukes is a challenger player in all 5 roles, including ADC. Udon Bidon got to play kind of the role that maybe he's a little bit more comfortable with. He's also one of the lesser-known players in terms of his accomplishments outside of CLOL specifically. And so it resulted in actually Nukes having a great Kaisa game in game number 1. Then having a bit of a tough one in game number 2 as SCAD answered back really nicely with just dominating a Caitlyn Hui lane from Mixture and Skipture. That was really peak Mixture Skipture that we were able to see in this tournament. We didn't get to see many other bright spots for them in this event, unfortunately. But the next 2 games dominated here by PNW. Aojun really stepped up towards the back half of things, played a great Tristana game in game 3, and then the Aurora obviously to close things out. And Nukes was able to do pretty good on the Ezreal and the Varus as well. And I like this look a lot better from Purdue Northwest. For some reason, seeing Nukes on an AD carry instead of the support, that gave me a little bit. That gave me a little more juice, and obviously it gave Purdue a little bit more juice as they ended up advancing into top 12, which also I think is the farthest that they've ever gotten in their history. And then the U-Tactics, going up against University of Toronto Mississauga, a fan favorite here on Office Hours if you've been watching all the episodes from the first iteration. They end up dropping to UHSP. I think Munchie tried his hardest in this series, but I think the MVP for this one was definitely Everott on the Zoe, specifically in game number 1, then the Ari game number 2, and the Syndra in game number 3. UHSP were able to survive a 1-9 performance from Sir Zipri in the bot lane on Ashe because Munchie just killed him on repeat on Talon Jungle. But the big mismatch going into this series was going to be the mid lane, with Everott going up against Snow2, who is a role swap mid laner, obviously. And the CBLOL player ended up really, really dominating, getting his pocket pick in game 1, and then really taking over the rest of the series. And I think more than actually picking up a ton of kills for himself, actually making sure Snow2 just had a really tough time overall playing the series. He really never got going. had a really tough Tristana game in game number 3 as well. Munchie was doing everything he damn could on the jungle carries. Jin Zhao in game number 1, Talon in game number 3. But just was not enough for them. Game number 3 should have been won by UTM in my opinion. Just the way they were so far ahead with Munchie on this Talon, but the team fighting from UHSP is really, really good, really solid, and resulted in them winning this game and sweeping UTM, taking them out of competition at the top 16 stage and forcing UHSP to move on to another matchup in the lower bracket. So they live for another day, and that takes us into Sunday, where there were 4 best of 5s played. This is not right. I clicked backwards. There we go. Not this one, not the bracket. We're looking at the lower round 4, which happened on Sunday. Let's start off with the game that was broadcasted by myself, Alec Battery, on the Uni Esports NA channel, and that was Winthrop University taking on St. Clair. I think some people were hopeful for a St. Clair revival after Winthrop have both knocked them out previously in CLOL, also defeated them in the LAN. But St. Clair, I don't know, maybe people were thinking that things could actually go well for them. And the people were maybe in a better spot once it was announced that Mobility was having trouble getting onto his PC at home, and that meant that Artemis had to play AD carry for game number 1 of their series against St. Clair. And for us, we were like, oh gosh, like, is Winthrop really going to bow out like this? That would be such a sad way for them to end their CLOL run. After all the unfortunate situations that have happened to them already this year, the fact that then Mobility would not be available to play their first game, maybe for the series, which is what we were maybe anticipating going in, but ended up not actually being the case. Artemis still was able to take control of the bot lane. He got a lot of help from Wilson and Sword on the Nocturne Rise. He got a couple of kills early, was able to use that advantage. Shout out to Artemis for being able to accomplish that. And they won the game kind of based off of that. Denethor had a great Gnar game as well. I think the biggest difference in this series overall was how much better Denethor was than either of the top lanes, whether it was Riki or Sama. Unfortunately for them, Denethor just gapped him in all 3 games. The Gnar got multiple solo kills against Sama. The Renekton got a bunch of impact in that game as well. And then the Mbessa in game number 3 was able to play really nicely into a like kind of a pick comp that Winthrop set up for themselves in that game number 3 when they were up 2-0. Mobility came back in game number 2. He showed Artemis what he could do on the Lucian as well in the clincher. Wilson decided to play the Rengar to end the series. A little bit of a for fun pick and ended up working out. The Malzahar for Sword was a very fascinating one to me. Did pretty well into the Rise, obviously, here for St. Clair. Flocon did not have himself the best series. I think really nobody on St. Clair had themselves a very good series. Lig tried his best in some situations, but never really got off and running. I kind of preferred Lig on more like late game oriented AD carries instead of being on things like the Lucian and the Callista, but if you're St. Clair and you're not winning anywhere else and you want to try to really focus your attention somewhere like in the bot lane to try to just get a lane ahead and try to win that way, I respect it. So that kind of is what it is there. Other things to say here about St. Clair specifically is this is the end of their run. Again, I think having Maddie, having his champion pool be limited definitely hurt what St. Clair were able to do. The fact that I really just didn't like him on a Sejuani, and it is a little bit interesting to see that his best game was actually on the Lilia at the end of the series when they were basically already eliminated. I wonder what we would have gotten if we saw a little bit more priority on picks like that, because that is a very, very solid pick in the meta right now, and Maddie's very good at it. So all that to say, a very good run by St. Clair. They took care of business when they had to in the East, but still were not able to fully punch up above their weight against some of the better teams, like the top tier teams in CLOL. So they're kind of still in that tier 2. We'll see if they can break out of that sometime soon. Let's go over to... Yeah, let's just go in order here, left to right. Even though this happened a little bit later on in the week. This was Northwood going up against Weber State. This happened actually just on Wednesday, so a couple of days ago as I'm recording this. And this was a fascinating series for a number of different reasons. Obviously, the West last stand against Northwood, who probably was favored going into the series, but then we learned that there were some tech issues at the start of the series, and that was because Will was playing at the school PC, and for some reason TR just was not working on that computer. He was playing on 300 ping for the first 3 games of this series, and it definitely looked like it at times, where game number 1 specifically, U13 and Goku had themselves a field day up against Northwood. They ended up taking over this game and winning it rather easily. So a pretty clean win for Weber State in game number 1. It was matched nicely by a very solid instinct laning phase turned into game win here for Northwood in game 2. And then in game 3, it was won by Weber State again. And that was a large part due to U13 once again, who honestly, like, I don't know, like, if we're gonna do certain like all NBA or all pro team awards or anything. I think U13 so far has played like a top jungler in CLOL in this tournament specifically, and deserves some love if we do something like that. So that's like a little shout out to U13 specifically. The Belveth pocket pick getting whipped out in game number 3 was great. Ended up winning them the series. Fortunately for Weber State, after game number 3, Will was able to get back home to another friend's house or something and play on their computer. And that ended up working out pretty well for them. They dominated game number 4 and then won game number 5 with relative ease. It was a much more one-sided game, I think, once Will was able to actually play on normal ping. Getting the Neferi in game number 5, another champion that I continue to mention is just so strong in this current meta. I'm very curious to see what the win rate actually looks like here for Neferi in CLOL specifically, because I know they looked it up in the NACL broadcast, and it was very high. It's a very strong champion, especially in this current meta and with the current teams that are involved. So Northwood end up winning. Weber State knocked out. The West is down, but I think overall Weber State should be proud of themselves for the tournament that they played. I know some of their stock might have been dropping a little bit after some of the struggles that they had towards the end of the regular season, is never being able to beat UCI, losing to Grandview in the way that they did. But I think they can still be proud of themselves for how this series went and how their run in CLOL went overall. Our next series was UST up against Purdue Northwest, and another fun little storyline to talk about here is we had another little roster substitution with a top team in the CLOL National Championships. We'll get into that in just a bit. This series, fascinating one. Neferi going into the mid lane in game number 1. I think that was for Aljun, as I think Purdue Northwest won this first game. Then after that, I think UST won this first game. The UST series are really confusing me overall because I keep forgetting what actually happened in each of them. I think this was a situation where Purdue Northwest was in the process of potentially reverse sweeping UST. I want to double check that to make sure I'm completely correct. Some of the big major takeaways that I had here from this series overall was that this UST team still doesn't look like it's fully meshed together, and that's a bit of a shame. But yes, UST winning game number 1 in this one. Looks like Porsche's Olaf had himself a pretty good game. Game number 2, also won by UST. The Kog'Maw lane was interesting from Nukes, but it did not end up actually doing particularly well. And this was a 29-minute victory here by Purdue Northwest, by UST. But then Purdue Northwest started to come back a little bit here. They won game number 3, I think off the back of a large lead that Aljun was able to pick up in the mid lane, specifically over Bradley, which that's a big matchup. Player that people expected to be in the NACL versus a player that is in the NACL. Actually going Aljun's way that series or that game at least, was very fun to kind of observe. And then in game number 4, a lot more of a one-sided victory here for Purdue Northwest. They ended up winning this pretty handily. I think Aljun's Ari had another really great performance. Nukes flipped it a little bit on the Ezreal a couple times, I will not lie, but it came down to, I think, like a bit later, like a bit of a later game team fight that just kind of went Purdue Northwest's way. And they end up winning that one and forcing a game number 5. And this is a very sad end to the game, to the series here for PNW, where they locked in Aljun's A-Soul, which was the Bradley special of locking in Aurelion Soul against in a game number 5 in a do-or-die situation. He did that a bunch of times in the qualifiers last year when he was on CCG. He did, and then Aljun kind of was going to hand it back to him. But the Lee Sin for Alchemist did not find too many successes. The Aurora in the top lane for Prank didn't go super well. And Ray specifically was really able to come alive in this one. Now, another interesting thing that happened in the midst of this reverse sweep is that Nova came in to play support for UST in that game 5. He was the one piloting this Karma, not Trevor, who ended up actually getting benched in a way off of that last game. And we do actually also know that Trevor will not be playing for UST for the remainder of CLOL. It'll be Nova kind of filling that shoe the rest of the way. And that Trevor has his ups and downs in terms of controversies as a player specifically, but it seemed like for some reason, whatever was the formula as 5 was not working for them, and so they wanted the players and the coaching staff and everyone at UST made the decision to put Nova in for the rest of the tournament. Very curious to see how that works out, because I think overall UST had a very slow start to this event. And this brings up another interesting topic, actually, that I wanted to discuss just a little bit here, is the kind of differences between schools that play a lot together as a unit as a college team versus schools that don't. Where you look at a team like UST, where they have players that all compete, at the NACL qualifier, NACL levels, or have in the past, but they don't actually play together as a unit in those events. Versus Winthrop, Ole Miss, and Maryville, who all do that. Even St. Clair played in the OQs together. It's just interesting to see that this year the synergy just never ended up forming here for UST. And in the past, sorry, voice crack. The reason that didn't happen for UST was because Shogo was on the team and it was ineligible. But it's interesting that they didn't decide to play any tournaments together as a 5-man unit throughout the entire year. And it was obviously to give players like Array the opportunity to play in the NACL. He's currently doing pretty well on CCG. But yeah, that's kind of an interesting note that I made here, is that UST definitely don't look as good, and I wonder how much of that is attributed to the fact that they just maybe have not gotten a lot of reps together to play as a 5-man unit or really play at all in terms of scrimming, when you're so focused, when you have players that are so focused on other things involving CLOL. And then that raises up the question of, if you're bringing these kids in on scholarship, why should they be, going and spending time playing for other teams? Should they really just be focusing on, doing the best for your school specifically? And so all these things kind of mesh together into the conversation of, I think maybe if USC did play together a little bit more throughout the whole year. I mean, even schools like Grandview, who were also in the OQs, but even like an ISU, for instance, who has music playing in the NACL with Blue Water, they were able to play throughout a lot more of the year because they entered things like NACE. I don't think UST was really in anything like that other than the LAN that happened in St. Clair, which is like a one-day event. So if you are ISU, you're able to play more, even though you have that NACL conflict, because you are able to play in a league like NACE. So interesting little things, interesting little developments there. But congrats for UST for moving on. I really hope that they can pull it together, because I think at their strength, at their peak strength, this is a roster that can contest with the likes of a of a Ole Miss, of a Maryville, even with Shimmer and Toasty potentially in. And I'm curious to see what that matchup could end up looking like. Our last series that we're going to recap here is ISU against UHSP. This is a matchup that ISU has won 2 times in a row, 3-0. They swept them both times over. But UHSP had other ideas this time around. What a series this was between these two teams. It started off in a very interesting situation where it looked like ISU were going to win. And then all of a sudden, they get aced around Baron. They decide to pull the Baron while they were up a lot of gold to UHSP. And Sir Zipri, who had himself a very rough early game, ends up popping off on a team fight on the Sivir. They end up running down mid and just ending the game, which was incredible to me. Incredible to watch. Shout out to UHSP for winning that first game. They then win the second game, maybe a little bit more handily, and it goes back to the issue of Meslo being a bit of a, I hate to say it, but a bit of a liability here for ISU against specifically Evrot in this series. The Riven mid lane did not really do too much there. He struggled on the Azir compared to Evrot on the Ahri. Now, obviously, Evrot's a great player, but I was hoping that Meslo was able to put up a little bit more of a fight, and he always seemed like he was on the back foot compared to what Evrot was able to output, even in the Game 3 win that they had, which was off the large back of Fadichan on the Kalista, really creating a lot of plays, dominating the early game, and turning it into a win for the Redbirds. So we got to that decisive game number 4. Again, Meslo did struggle, unfortunately. Barlow on the Bard didn't do too much. And everybody on UHSP really came to play, specifically in the team fights. Shout out to James on the Nefiri, going 8-1-12. Shout out to Evrot, obviously on the Talia, going 8-1-13. And then, Zepri doing a lot in this series as well. The Eutectics move on to top 8. And I don't think many people were going to expect to say that going into this tournament, especially just because of how, again, like Weber, they had some rough times at the end of their specific seasons. And so all that to say, they have advanced. They have been one of the most fun Cinderella runs to watch so far. And I can't wait to see what could potentially be next for them against USD. So we've done all of our recaps here, and we could take a quick look at the bracket overall, just to take a general sense of what things do look like in the space right now. Western, obviously the only double-digit team currently still in the upper bracket. They will be playing up against Ole Miss, Maryville against Fisher, and then in the bottom half of the bracket, in our lower section, in our loser section, the one team that has gone fully through the lower end of the bracket, that did not jump down from the uppers, is UHSP at this point. They're actually the only people to get to the round before that, as well, as they, alongside Minnesota, were the only teams to win 2 series, and now they've won 4. And so they're going to be playing against UST. That's a tough matchup for them, obviously. I believe that the loser of the Maryville-Fisher matchup goes here. The loser of the Ole Miss versus Western matchup goes here, or maybe it's swapped around. I have to double check exactly what that would look like, but those are the matchups that could be happening on Sunday of this weekend. So speaking of UHSP, I wanted to go back and look to see the last time a bottom 16 team made it all the way to top 8 in CLOL, and it's a little bit hard to do because the 32 team era only existed starting in 2021, but since that era, the only instance of that I could find was that legendary Converse run where they were seated in the bottom half of things, and they ended up top 4 after beating Michigan State in the top 8 at LAN. Shout out to Scary Jerry, obviously playing the Zera support in that series to wrap it up here for Converse. They ended up going top 4, losing to Bay State in the semifinals. UHSP are the best performing lower half team since Converse. And we talk about Converse all the time, so this run by the U-Tactics has to be celebrated, has to be obviously treated with a lot of honor. And that's exactly what they have done so far, so shout out to them. Before we get into our previews for the games that are happening this week, a couple of other headlines that have gone throughout the CLOL scene that normally we might have talked about on Salty Runback, but we didn't get the opportunity to do that this week. So we're going to do it here on Office Hours. Remember, if you have enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to watch all the episodes of Office Hours that we have been posting week after week since the start of the regular season on our Patreon for $5 a month. First headline, University of Western Ontario. The story for this team has been very, very interesting. They announced right before the start of the tournament that they were going to only play one more series together against Winthrop University. And they cited vacation plans plus no rewards for top 8 to call today our last games. They have little motivation to play anymore as an unsupported club. And I think a lot of people were critical of the decision for Western to do this. First of all, because of the fact that all the rules and all the things that they potentially could have seen about the reasons for not wanting to play, specifically the vacation plans and the no rewards left for top 8. The prize pool did get significantly cut, but we talked about that on an Office Hours episode back in February. And this rule set has been around, and the prize pool has been around since like last year, since basically last summer. And so when Western signed up to play CLOL proper in the East Conference, they could have looked this up. And I know if you're Lynx, who ended up being the person who had his vacation plans like kind of in this situation, you have to be aware of that. And I don't know. I think if I was Western, if I saw these problems, I would have dropped out of the tournament before, instead of just like basically threatening to FF. And that is where some of the criticism did end up lying. Obviously, they're an unsupported club. They do deserve to, make a couple mistakes, but I think it is fair to criticize them for making some certain mistakes like they did here. However, they won their series against West of Winthrop, and all of a sudden they started to change their minds a little bit. Then they said, okay, we'll play one more series against UST. And then they won that one. And now they're like, oh God, what do we do? Now, I pointed out last week on Office Hours that Western had 2 support players on their sub list. They had Animosity and Tyson, who was the support player for Friendly Fellows, the team that went to the OQ finals against Near Airport with Wixie, and Tyson was his support. Tyson was Wixie's support, and he was listed as a sub on the roster sheet for Western. However, apparently, what ended up happening is that they just put him on the roster sheet ineligibly because Tyson is not actually currently a student at the university. He's ineligible to play for this tournament. But it looks like they have figured it out. And the announcement that was made a couple of days ago is that Western will be playing with a substitute support player, and they will be continuing their final run for the audience without our star player, as they quote. I find it funny that they think Lynx is their star player because he's out of position. If he's really your star player, you have him playing AD carry. But they seem to think that Julian is the better answer at that position specifically. But shout out to Vince. I don't know exactly the IGN of him. We'll have to look that up in a little bit. Who will be playing support for Western throughout the rest of the run. I hope the best for them. I hope they get that prize money that they were trying to get in the first place. They need to get top 4. They need just one more series win to do it. And honestly, I think that they have a little bit of magic in them at this point. Going on a bit of a Cinderella run. This is like their last dance. This is the way to do it. You announce that this is your last dance, and you play the entire tournament out. I'm glad they're able to do it. Shout out to Lynx. I hope he has a good vacation as well. Shout out to Western Mustangs for, being able to accomplish this much as just being a club program. I think very clearly and very easily, being able to be named the most successful club team in CLOL history. So shout out to Western for that. Other news. 07 to Dekkar, as Tim Bui, our beloved CLOL admin, head admin of CLOL and CVAL, announced that he was leaving GG Tech and leaving the CLOL championships and leaving his involvement with it basically in the middle of the national championships. Now, obviously that creates a bit of a precarious situation for us, most notably the stat sheet that we were looking at last week involving the involvements of the records, the rosters, and specifically the game results and where the games were streamed is all not available to the public anymore. Now, we're hoping to try to get some of that information back eventually, but obviously, now that Tim is no longer a part of GG Tech, basically, this was just a supplementary thing that he made kind of on good faith, because for GG Tech and for Uni Esports, where we're supposed to be getting our information from is the University Esports website, which if you ever look at it, doesn't have as much information and as much data as Tim's spreadsheet has been able to put together. And that's why I'm pretty disappointed with that decision. It seems to me, by looking through some of these tweets, that Tim had an issue with the fact that GG Tech refused to fly him out to Raleigh for the finals, and also, didn't fly him out to Boise. He had to fly himself out there for that event. Actually, I don't know if not many people know that. And also, he put out a tweet that said, he gets paid less than McDonald's cashier annually. So, knowing Tim and talking to him about what he's been able to do in CLOL specifically, first of all, he's very good at his job. If anybody's looking for a tournament organizer or some sort of competitive ops admin or something like that, this is your guy. He's going to put so much passion and so much effort into this role, even more than maybe you are able to. So that is just the kind of guy Tim is, and the amount of respect that I have for him, in terms of the work that he does. But also, it seems like they weren't paying him very much, and he seemingly was doing like five jobs and way more than he was potentially even asked to do. And even though he was doing more than he was asked to do, it ended up becoming a situation where GG Tech started relying on him to do those things that he was kind of not being asked to do at some point. And so it seemed to have come to some sort of head, and now Tim is no longer part. Obviously, wishing him the best, hoping that we can still close out the CLOL championship the best way possible. But if you are looking for some of the advanced stats and things like that, that's not going to necessarily be available unless Uni Esports somehow fixes their website that has been broken for the past 2 years to get things like match histories in there involved. This is why I've been grabbing screenshots from as many of the games as possible to just try to make sure we have some sort of record outside of just going back and watching the VODs in some sort of a simple form. And hopefully that means that we'll be able to get some sort of record of this. Obviously, a lot of the VODs are being published as well. But those are my takes on this here. I think that Tim is going to be missed at GG Tech, and I hope that they are able to try to fill in as best as they can for him. All right, what we're going to do here now, to wrap up this episode of CLOL Office Hours, we're going to go to every game that is happening today on Saturday in both the upper semifinals and the lower bracket quarterfinals, I believe is what we can call it here, as we're going to narrow our top 8 to a top 6 by the end of the day today. There are 2 series in the upper bracket, 2 series in the lower bracket, and what we will be doing is going through each of them, breaking down what the matchup could look like, and I have some keys to the game for each team in order to say what they need to do in order to win their series. So we're going to start things off here with UHSP up against UST, the number 3 seed from the North against the South Conference champions. Now, obviously going into the series, if you had this slated in as a matchup, many people would favor UST. However, after seeing what UHSP has been doing, taking down teams like ISU and UCI, and seeing what UST has been doing, which has been losing a lot, specifically to Western, which was not good and nearly falling to Purdue Northwest, this is suddenly a bit more of an interesting series to me. And I think that still UST are favored going in, but if they look like anything that they look like last week. If they have not like severely, if they have not gone through their St. Louis University arc of like sitting down, like hashing it out, and then like really hardcore scrimming, hardcore boot camping, I think UHSP absolutely could win this series, win the best of 5. And for UHSP, what I want to ask for them to do is continue to try to keep the magic going. You're obviously the severe underdogs. You are going to lose at least one of these games here. But I feel like this team is just so vibes oriented, where they are able to do a lot just in terms of keeping up their good spirits. They have like Johnny Rockets and James, big vibes guys on the team specifically. And so I think that kind of positive attitude is something that we see in a lot of the Cinderella stories of like college basketball, obviously, and we're seeing it a little bit here in CLOL. Obviously, much easier to do that when you're winning, but my advice to them is to try to keep those vibes, keep that energy up, even if they are losing games, losing in the series, potentially in a match point situation. And also to play their game. I feel like UHSP have one of the more succinct, real identifiable play styles out of any of the CLOL teams that are still left, which is that we are going to scale and play team fights really well. And obviously UST can do that as well, but if UHSP can just kind of survive the early game, make sure Zipri is not like 10 kills behind like he sometimes is against other teams, and then just come back and just play the team fights well, because that is exactly how UHSP were able to win a lot more games than maybe they were expected to, which is not necessarily the early game, but what they can do in the late game in these team fights. So draft for it. Make sure you are able to set your lanes up so they just don't completely get blown over. And then if you team fight against them, if you can play your game there, that's where UHSP, I think, can have an angle to perform in this series. However, UST are certainly the favorites still here, and I think that when you look across the board, they probably have better players on all sides of the map. You can make an argument for Bradley versus Evrot, but I would argue that Bradley probably is the better player, given what I've been able to see from him versus Evrot. In the CBLOL, never really high performing in that league, and even in CLOL was not really too much of a standout. I think like player like Goku was outplaying him specifically in like in the NECC matches that we were watching of him. But Ever obviously has really stepped it up here for CLOL. I think Bradley is another one of those players that can perform a little bit more in the clutch, and so I'm hoping to see him kind of really step up. And much like I was saying, how Sir Zipri oftentimes can fall behind a lot in the laning phase. Obviously, he's not a natural AD carry player. If you are able, as UST, to get Array ahead, this is how you win the series. Like if Array's 5-0 at the 15-minute mark, like in any of these games, USC should win, obviously, because they have the better players. They have to be able to scale and snowball those leads that they do generate, because they are going to generate leads. The question is, what can they do with them once you close out games efficiently? Use that better player privilege to get yourself those leads, kind of force your hand and force those leads onto your players, and kind of go from there. And also, USC, man, you gotta respect the pocket picks here. I know that you didn't ban the ASOL in the first 2 games. That ended up costing you. You got to make sure you do that in this series against UHSP. Evrot has got a great Zoe. Johnny Rockets, he hits the things like the Gwen and the Rumble. I guess those aren't really pocket picks, but Zipri's Sivir is definitely something that has to be targeted here for UHSP as well. I think those 2 champions specifically, if you just ban them every game, I feel like you can play your own map, play your own game, use that better player privilege, and potentially come out with a win relatively easily here. That's what the expectations were coming in, and if USC play the way that we were expecting them to coming in, I think they should win this series. However, something about that Eutectic Magic, man, I think this series is going to go 5 games. That's my take. And then once we're in Game 5, who knows what happens after that. Our next series, also in the lower bracket, Northwood up against Winthrop. Now, this is a rematch of the lower bracket quarterfinals, the lower bracket semifinals, quarterfinals of the NECC, where Northwood ended up losing to Winthrop 3-1. However, this was a competitive series when it was played. It was just one that Winthrop were able to win. How can Northwood win? I feel like, honestly, looking at the map right here, Will and Reppy have the opportunity to actually maybe outplay Wilson and Sword a little bit. I think when Will has been on good ping, he's been good. Obviously, the first 2 games against Weaver were rough, but to wrap things up in the series, Will was really, really dominant and still is a very good AD carry, or really, very good jungler. And Reppy has had some really clutch moments in this CLOL as well. And if he and Will can really get ahead, that is how Northwood overall have been winning a lot of their games. Some of it has been instinct, but I think that in this specific matchup, Mobility and Only 35 are going to have that advantage. So playing around bot lane isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. So in my head for Northwood, you got to attack the mid lane here. And they also have to remember what happened last year, which is they went on this big lower bracket run into top 4. They're going to have to win 2 best of 5s in a row to kind of repeat that level of success. They could totally do it. I think we've repeatedly said this Northwood roster on paper should be stronger than the Northwood roster that made top 4 last year, in my humble opinion. But when you add players like Will and Instinct specifically, but it just hasn't really worked out for them just yet. They have continued to look better and better, but still are making some certain mistakes. Obviously, going to 5 games with Weber State wasn't ideal, despite the fact that there were some external circumstances there. But this would be a great way for Northwood to prove that they do belong. If they take down Winthrop, that would be big and really would maybe even set them up to being almost a favorite in whatever next series that they do play to potentially get into top 4. As for Winthrop, I really feel like they got to just continue to play through their superstars. Mobility had a great series against Shogo and Ole Miss Supernova today in the NACL as I'm recording this. So if you just play through Denethor, play through Mobility, Denethor was the clear MVP against St. Clair and Sama, Ricky. I think that Denethor could very, very easily do the exact same thing against Cozy if he gets the opportunity to, if he gets the lead. So if you are Wilson, if you are only 35, focus on getting Mobility and Denethor ahead. I feel like sometimes we get a little bit too lost in the sauce as Winthrop. We sometimes try to play different strategies for fun. Playing around bot lane and top lane worked so well for Winthrop when they played against St. Clair. Denethor got ahead, worked well. They got the Lucian at lanes ahead for Winthrop, and they ended up winning. So I think putting Sword in a more utility-oriented role, I think that's when he, specifically as a player, has looked the best, and also where Winthrop have looked the best. And so that's where I want to see them kind of make that bit of a shift. And also, I think this is more indicative of Supernova / Ole Miss in their series today. But if Ole Miss just needs, or Winthrop just need to take a deep breath sometimes. It feels like sometimes they get a little bit too caught up in certain things, and little mistakes that happen kind of spiral out of control for them. And I want to make sure, and I hope for them, they're able to kind of put things in perspective over the course of a 5-game series, that if one little thing goes wrong, you don't have to necessarily force something immediately after. You can just kind of sit back, relax, play for the next thing that you really think you can win, instead of panicking and making a rash decision that can cost you. So I feel like that's how Winthrop have lost a lot of their games. And for Northwood, that could be something that they could try to abuse. Who do I have winning this series? I think I have Winthrop 3-2, 3-1 maybe. I think that this could be close, and if Winthrop don't show up, Northwood definitely could win this. I had them beating Winthrop in my bracket, I believe. But if you did see Winthrop play in the NACL, they have looked better and better kind of as the weeks have gone on. And I really like what they looked like against St. Clair, so I have them winning this series. To the upper bracket we go. Ole Miss against Western, the NECC champions against the East runner-ups. Should be a relatively tame series. Should be Ole Miss favored. But we said the same thing about Western versus Winthrop and Western versus St. Thomas. So I think at this point, we can't be fooled again. We have to treat this like it is going to be a competitive series, and I really hope it is, because it's going to be streamed on the Uni Esports channel, casted by me and Hawk. It's going to be the first time Hawk and I are casting together, I think in 10 months or something. So make sure you tune in. It's going to be a lot of fun. This series is going to be a lot of fun. Ole Miss kind of reeling off of that loss in NACL. I want them to just kind of put that aside and recognize that, hey, we seemingly, for whatever reason, play much better on the CLOL stage than in NACL. There's different pressure. The players are different, obviously. So let's just lock in here for CLOL. But, that loss hopefully is not ringing too clear in any of their heads, because I really do love watching this team play. I think for Ole Miss, they had a very clear win condition, even against a bot lane like Fadikon and Barlow, which was played through bot lane, and it ended up working a lot of the time. Shogo carried 3 of the 4 games, and they ended up winning. I think the rest of the map could be, a little bit more of an even state. I'm curious to see what the top lane specifically looks like, Stray versus Dr. Calculus. But I think the bot lane is really where Ole Miss can get that advantage. If they win the early game, they'll be able to be doing fine, because I think similarly to UST in their matchup against UHSP, Western's strength is the team fight, is playing for these late games situations. And so if you're Ole Miss and you just are able to wallet diff them early and give Shogo a late game carry in a late game situation, it should never really be too hard of a situation for you. And similar to USC, just respect the pocket picks, ban the Ace Soul away from Julian is going to be big. Is going to be good. If Keel's not playing Nefiri, ban that away from Krakadon. If Stray's not playing Rumble, ban that away from Dr. Calculus. If Asila's not playing Victor, ban that away from Loves of Candy. There are certain pocket picks that are certain champions that Western just perform a lot better on. And so I know the boys do their prep. I know Colomer and the gang and Aloxio and the gang do their prep, do their work, but just respect to those specific picks and the specific play styles that Western are able to put out. As for Western, remember, one more series win, and they lock themselves up that juicy cash. They need to make sure that they get that. Is that the whole reason that why they were even threatening to drop out, and why maybe they're sticking around here for one more game. If they survive the laning phase, if they get things to an even state at 20 minutes, that's where we've seen Western really shine. We've seen Julian specifically in the AD carry position have these crazy pop-off moments on things like the Jinx, on the Aphelios, on the I forget other weird champ, the Nyla, the Asol. So get to the late game, send it on objectives, make Ole Miss like have to make decisions, because I feel like when Ole Miss are at their weakest is when they are being kind of slingshotted around multiple areas of the map. They lose something in the top lane, and it results in them also kind of losing out on play in the bot lane somehow, some way. And so that's how Ole Miss somehow struggle. And so if you're Western, honestly, sack that wave in the bot lane. Go for a neutral objective. Go start up that Otacon. If you just make Ole Miss a little bit dizzy, and you can pounce on a little bit of a misstep, a little bit of them, a little stumble that they do have, that's where I think Western can potentially have that advantage, have that opportunity to win. Do I think it's likely? I don't know. I think at this point, I have to respect the fact that Western have been dogs in this tournament. Ole Miss, this is already the farthest that they've gotten in CLOL. Western obviously have gotten further. They've made it to the finals before. So there's that pedigree you have to talk about a little bit as well. Obviously, none of the players specifically have made it to the final on this roster, but the school organization, the magic of Western certainly is here. The plot armor for Western certainly here as well. I'm going to say Ole Miss win. However, I feel like as soon as I say that, it's locking in at 3-2. So I'm going to say Ole Miss 3-0, 3-1, and they're going to move on to the upper finals, secure themselves a spot in top 3 in CLOL. And our final matchup to talk about is Maryville up against Fisher College, the champions from the north against the runner-ups from the NECC. And this is going to be a fun one to watch, most notably because this is the biggest test that Maryville are going to have to face so far, and also a real litmus test to see where Fisher are. I don't think that they played Maryville at all this season with this roster led by Brunus and Wyena. Very curious to see what they can do. For Maryville, playing through the bot lane will result in wins. We saw that against Northwood, even against the bot lane like Instinct and Clyde. I think that Brabro and Magi can be exploited a little bit, as we've seen from them in some of the other series that they've played. And so if you are Maryville, Sajed and Zyko have been so good. Sajed specifically has been playing a great CLOL so far. If you just get this guy ahead, have Shimmer, just send it down there perma, play the Maokai, play the Udyr or whatever. Yeah, that's what's going to work for you. And if Toasty and Shimmer are playing, I want to say ease the kids into it here. Give them their comfort champions. Don't give them too many responsibilities. Allow for Sajed and Zamudo to really take over these games, and that is what's going to result in Maryville having control and having that win. On the other side for Fisher, I think their big advantage is the jungle, and that's going to be the talking point for every single game that Maryville play from this point forward. Because every single game, the best player in CLOL, I think as a whole, was probably Yuji going into this tournament. However, now he's gone. Now he's on Team Liquid. And obviously, shout out to him, deserving of that opportunity. But for Maryville, it's a bit of a bad situation because it means now you have to play with Shimmer, who I think if we ranked Shimmer overall in our jungle tier list, I'd probably have him around 9th, 10th, around that 9th or 10th mark. And that's obviously a big drop-off compared to where Yuji was, a unanimous #1 jungler in the league. I think that Brunus definitely has the opportunity to try and exploit that, specifically because Brunus plays a lot of carries. He plays the Gwen jungle. He plays the Nefiri, obviously, that has done super well for him. Shimmer, overall so far, has been mostly on the utility picks. And so if you are Brunus, try to get ahead. Try to steal away some jungle camps. Try to generate an advantage for yourself in that mid jungle, specifically with Wyena. I think that is where Fisher can maybe find advantages, maybe find leads. I think the rest of the map definitely outclassed by Maryville, but that is where maybe Fisher are going to be able to exploit a little bit within the mid jungle. And obviously, I think this is Maryville favored. I'll give Fisher a game because I do think that there's a little bit of inconsistency with the roster situation for Maryville, obviously, and I do think Fisher is a solid team. But I will say Maryville 3-1. I feel pretty strongly about that. If they could just play through their bot lane, it'll be good. A little bit concerning that a lot of their games against Northwood took 35 to 45 minutes. But I still think that this team is good. I still think that they are the favorites, and I will have them beating Fisher College. So, with that being said, that is the end of our Office Hours episode here. Hopefully you had enough time to watch this before the games begin. And hopefully you enjoy all the CLOL action that will be happening. Again, I think this series specifically, I'm not 100% sure where that will be streamed. Check out my Twitter at SpeedyGrapes at SaltyRunbackNA, because we will be streaming UHSP versus UST on our channel, and then the main broadcast will be taking the other two series. First one being Ole Miss versus Western, casted by myself, and then Simo and Alk Battery will be here for Northwood versus Winthrop. So make sure you enjoy that. If you enjoyed this episode of CLOL Office Hours, or just me yapping about CLOL for an hour, follow us on our Patreon. You can subscribe down there. We're going to be trying to put up more content in that field as well. I think we're trying to push out a new episode of Shooting the Salt sometime soon. So if you enjoy that, obviously tune in for that as well. With that being said, thank you so much for watching this episode, and we will see you all next time here on CLOL Office Hours and on Salty Runback. New episodes coming out next week.